Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 450 of our Tick Bootcamp podcast. I'm really excited to be here today with Alan Bergo, our special guest from Minnesota. And I also have Khalil Fuller back with me as my special guest co host. So I'm going to hand it over to Khalil. And Khalil, if you can begin this podcast and walk us through Alan's life as a young kid.
Yes, Alan, thanks for joining in. Glad to have you here. How you doing today?
I'm doing all right.
So, Alan, how old are you and where are you from originally? Where were you born at?
Well, I'm 39. I was born in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and then kind of quickly moved to my family's ancestral farm, which is like 2 hours west of the Twin Cities. And I grew up there before I went to college here in the Twin Cities around 2003.
About how old were you when you moved to Minnesota?
Oh, maybe like three.
Oh, so still young, still
Yeah,
young. So
super young.
pretty much grew up there. Okay. So, what type of activities did you do when you were growing up? Like, were you a very outdoorsy person? Did you know, like, what type of things did you do?
I mean, I lived on a farm and in the cities, like when my parents split up when I was like 5, I would play outside on the farm. I didn't really get into being outdoors until my mid 20s. I was an indoor kid. I was an only child. I loved role playing games, uh, playing by myself. I was an only child, didn't have brothers or sisters, and I spent a lot of time inside. Uh, so I didn't really go play much outside until I was until my mid 20s. Really, until I started picking mushrooms was the thing.
Picking mushrooms. That sounds like an interesting story. So, no, we'll get into a lot later.
Oh yeah.
So, so where'd you go to school at? Like, where'd you go to school?
Oh, well, I went to high school out in Wilmer. It's a town of about maybe 30,000 people. And then I went to college at Hamlin here in St. Paul. It's a 4-year private university.
Well, what did you study in college?
Business. And then got sucked into the culinary industry and, worked as a professional chef, and I still do for 15 years directly in the kitchen. Then I left and I started writing. I wrote a book, filmed a couple TV shows, and now I write for my website, which is all about cooking with wild plants and mushrooms. I do that full time as that's my job now, and I'm working on a new book.
Is this something you kind of always been into, or were you just kind of finding your way once you got to when you was in high school and got to college? Is this something you just kind of just dibble dabbled and stuff like that, or was this something you was
No, it
always?
was it was cooking. I was always interested in cooking, and it was kind of always what I did to pay the bills. And I always knew that it didn't pay much money. But when I started working in restaurants, I worked in really nice places. And I ended up working in a restaurant here in the Twin Cities after I worked with a bunch of guys from Italy at different spots. I worked at a place where the menu changed every single day, and we only used food from within 200 miles of Minnesota, and I got to write the menu. So I got introduced to all these super local ingredients, and I was a young line cook, like I was a sous chef making like $28,000 a year, and I was like, how do I set myself apart? What's my thing? And I loved seasonal food. I loved where I live in the Midwest, and I started to see mushrooms and herbs and things come in, and I saw that they were way more expensive, and like the most precious ingredients that we got, I saw we paid more for wild stinging nettles than we did for any type of heirloom lettuce. I saw that we paid more for wild mushrooms than we did per pound for like any kind of meat. And then I didn't have any money. I was living in my friend's basement and no health insurance either, which we can get to. And I would go out and play disc golf before work because it was like something I could do that was free. And I started to see ingredients that would come into the restaurant when I was out playing disc golf. And I was like, oh, I can bring these into the restaurant and chef will buy them. And then I can put them on the menu and I'll be rich. I'll be lucky to fill my gas tank was the reality. But what it did was I started to teach myself, and I started to teach myself a skill set that was complementary to the world of food that I was in, but I started getting into this niche, the niche that my colleagues and I would now call the wild food world, which encompasses mushroom hunting. Every one of the 50 states has a mycological society and mushroom hunters. And I mean, there's probably like 7 or 8 Facebook groups just for mushroom hunting in Minnesota alone. And wild plants and botanists and gardeners and plant-based cookers, and then the hunting community, like all of this kind of encompasses the wild food world. And I started to get into that. There were no resources. Uh, we had field guides and things like that, but there was no resources for cooking these things. And I had been cooking these things. Now I kind of was spoon-fed because of my work at the restaurant, where I knew what I was looking for and the best varieties of things and how to cook them before I saw them outside. I had already put them on a menu and created dishes with them. So it was really speed learning, but I knew right away. I think I describe it as like Emperor Constantine when he saw like the cross in the sky, and he said, "Ign hoc signo vinces," like in this sign I will conquer. And I was like, "This is my thing." And I bought myself every book on mushroom hunting and identification that I could. Sometimes you go out and you don't find mushrooms, so then I started learning about plants, and I found mentors in those areas. And when I was living in my friend's basement, I would cook him breakfast with things that I found, which probably sounds a little weird, but it's like morels on toast is pretty good. Uh, and he said he worked for Thomson Reuters as an SEO analyst, and he said, "We need to start you a website. This is so cool. You need to share this with the world." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Had no idea what that entailed, but we started doing that in my friend's basement. Uh, I mean, fast forward 13 years, it's my full-time career, and I write about it every week.
No, that's very awesome. So it seemed like seem like during your course of your career, you got a lot in tune with nature and started going outside and picking these things. Like, what was that kind of experience like? Just going outside and actually picking things from outside in the wild to actually bring them into your environment to start cooking. Like, how did that go about?
It's it taught me so many things. It made me really, I feel one of the things I didn't expect was that it would make me feel in tune with like the seasons with where I live. Like, every single person in the world is descended from a forager, and those like instincts, we were foragers for much longer than we lived sedentary lives in front of a computer and screens and at a desk. And those instincts, I kind of liken them to like having a bike in your garage that's been passed down through generations. Well, once you get on it and you start riding it, those instincts, they really start to come back quick. And now, like if I go outside in the spring, I can look at one thing. This is called phenology, where I can look at, oh, the oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear. This is about the time to go out and look for morels, or the lilacs are blooming. And I can look at all these different things and know that other things are ready, which is kind of like an instinct that our ancestors had that we don't really have right now. And it's kind of eerie. Like I can look out in go out in the middle of summer and say like, oh, it's going to be about 2 weeks until the butternuts are ready, and these types of wildflowers are ready, and these greens are past, and these mushrooms are going to come if we get rain in a specific area with a specific soil type. Uh, I This kind of stuff kind of like awakened in me, and I was like, it was fascinating, and I'm kind of a habitual learner, and I just wanted to study more and more and more, and now I can go out and pick a couple hundred different types of wild plants, maybe like 60 or 70 different species of mushrooms. I could do that in a single year now.
So tying that all into the reason why you're here today, like when you were doing all that, did you know anything about the dangers of being outside, the insects and ticks of anything of that nature? Do you know anything about this, or did you just learn along the way, or did you have friends tell you about watch out for this while you're out there doing all this and that?
It was on the periphery. I mean, I think my dad was probably the one that warned me the most, like, be careful, like there's ticks out there and stuff like that. Like I knew. I was also young and full of piss and vinegar, and I went out. Well, let's see what happened. I was leading a foray. I think some people paid me like $50, and I took them up to a spot to pick lobster mushrooms. And after we got done, I had like 2 ticks embedded in my chest. And then, like a few days later, I drove all the way up to Canada to go to the boundary waters to try to get into a burned area because there's a wildfire, and wildfires will make morels come the next year in large amounts. And I got bit by another tick. I also picked some mushrooms up there that I was going to eat that were technically edible. So I kind of was playing fast and loose with things a little bit, and I ended up bringing this mushroom home. It was called a lexinum, and I cut it into thin slices and I poured some boiling broth over it and I ate it. And oh, did I get so sick. But the problem here is that the mushroom is edible, but you need to thoroughly cook it. So I just didn't cook it enough. I got so sick. And then from there, the sickness, it didn't get better. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm reading up mushroom things on mushroom poisoning. I'm like, I've destroyed my kidneys. Like, what have I done? I don't know what I'm doing. Like I'm having imposter syndrome. So then I didn't have health insurance. So I went into uh like a minute clinic or something like that. And they're like, oh, this guy is just crazy. He just poisoned himself. Like, just go home. Like 3 days later, I didn't get bullseyes, but I got pure solid ovals all over my body that appeared. And then when that happened, then I knew. And I was like, oh my God. I didn't have mushroom poisoning. I have Lyme disease. And those ticks I picked out of my chest, one of them probably had Lyme. Like I picked them out and I just like threw them away. You know, didn't think anything about it. Like, oh, it'll be fine. Invincible.
Was that your first time ever seeing a tick on you, like interacting with your tick? Was that your first
Oh
time ever
no. Oh
experiencing
no.
a tick?
I knew ticks were a thing, and I knew the difference between a deer tick and a dog tick. Uh, I can still remember the first time that a girlfriend of mine and I were going hiking to go pick mushrooms, and then we stepped on a nest of ticks, and
Oh,
then both of us we just looked down, and there's like hundreds crawling up your legs, and I remember us both going to the bathroom and screaming every time we found a new tick, and there's like 50 on me or something like that, but they were dog ticks, you know. So the deer ticks are different. Um, so once the bullseye, not the bullseyes, but once I got all those rashes, then I went back in and demanded the Western blot, which, as you guys probably know, is like that's a conundrum in itself and kind of
exactly.
imprecise, and it really got a rude awakening into a new world and a new reality. Uh, because then the symptoms started, and I'm working at a restaurant. I'm on the busiest station of the restaurant. There was like 8 to 14 different items on my station that I would prep and make new every single day, and I started to have this mental fog. It was hard for me to think. It was hard for me to concentrate. I was the anchor of this entire restaurant, which is like what it was one of the best restaurants in the whole upper Midwest. And then the palsy kicked in, and half of my body, like if you drew a line, was basically didn't work. I had to cook with an eye patch on, and then I had to have earplugs in because the sound of metal, like certain timbres and sounds, I was really sensitive to. Like two metal pans clinking together was like a gunshot going off next to my ear, and my eye sunk back into my head, and it got all weird. So I wore an eye patch. Light, I was really sensitive to light, and I got this crazy X-Files feeling, like I could feel like there was something sentient inside my body. That was one of the most like unnerving and unsettling things. And I remember like breaking down in tears one night on the line and like running outside because I didn't know what was happening to me. And I had never gone through anything like this. And it was absolutely terrifying, especially like with the Lyme, I couldn't talk. That was like they called me Chef Mushmouth or the pirate because I was wearing an eye patch. And they took me, my boss, who's a celebrity chef, took me off of you know, the biggest station, Saute, and called me his new salad girl and put me onto Garmanger for
Wow.
eight months. And I thought they were going to fire me.
Now, how old were you when this first happened? When you first went through the foray and you found the ticks on you, how old were you when this happened?
I was 28.
And how long have you been working at the restaurants, like at that point in time?
I'd been working in restaurants for over 10 years.
You said over 10 years, and then,
Yep.
this happened. So once you were starting to get out, you found the ticks and all this stuff started to happen. You ate the mushroom and you realized this wasn't happening. Like, how long did you continue to still work? I know you said you still kept working and stuff like that and sweating and all this.
Uh,
How long did you continue to work?
after I went to the Minute Clinic, it's crazy. I had the symptoms and all of that. I didn't have the rashes yet, but after that, when they told me to just go home, I went directly back to work and plated a party of 60, like a 5-course meal.
After you left the doctor, the
After
minute
I left the doctor,
you went straight
I
to
went
work.
straight to work. I worked through the entire thing, and I didn't have health insurance. And then there was another. I had what was really crazy is and in a really interesting thing about Lyme. Lyme is neurological. The the Lyme interacted with a pre-existing condition. Like, I don't consider myself having chronic Lyme, but I have Lyme complications. So the pre-existing condition I had was a neurological condition called cluster headaches, and it's bizarre. I had them since I was about 17. They like come with the moon and the tides. It's one of the most painful conditions that humans can have. It's like a migraine on steroids, but they would come like once a year for a month. And during that month, I can't have alcohol, really no alcohol. And like about a certain time every day, I would have insane headaches that no painkillers can take away. And the only way I can make the pain go away is by exercising. And I
Hmm.
found that I would need to do like 600 to 700 jumping jacks to get one attack to go away. So I would maybe get 2 or 3 attacks during a day during a 1 month period, which is the cycle, which the cycles change. They could be gone for years. They could last for 2 or 3 months. They could last for a single month. When I got the Lyme, it immediately kicked me into chronic cluster headaches, and I had 4 to 5 or more attacks all throughout the day, 365 days a year.
Alan, I'm just going to jump in real quick here because I want to just comment on a few things you're saying. So, you know, I think it's all how we look at it, right? So it's interesting. You're noting that you had all these cluster headaches, and then when you got Lyme disease, they became more chronic. And you look at this as Lyme complications, not chronic Lyme. But I can tell you, as a child, I had something not as drastic as you're saying, but I went to a neurologist as a child because I had frequent migraines, and I was able to work through that. And as I got older, I became a little bit healthier. I started exercising and I didn't have them anymore. Then I got sick with Lyme disease and I had a migraine pretty much every day for a year straight, right? So, similar idea. I guess my question to you is, do you believe if you didn't get Lyme disease that your cluster headaches would have become chronic, or do you think you would have been able to manage them like you did pre-Lyme?
Oh, I would have absolutely been able to manage them, and I figured out a way to manage it too. I figured that let's see. First, I got hooked up with this Harvard neurologist, Dr. David Perlmutter, down in Florida. He put me on this regimen of like 14 different herb pills. 2 weeks later, the headaches went away, and then they went into remission until I started eating gluten.
Oh, we're going to get there, Alan. So, yeah, so many things I want to dive down. But before we get a little bit deeper into your story, I want to kind of pull back a little bit more because you mentioned you were bitten prior to that. I'll call it perfect storm, right? Because I just want to highlight this again. You said you were out on a trip, you ate a mushroom that was undercooked and it caused you to become sick. You were bitten by ticks on this trip. You were then bit by a tick again a few weeks later, right? And all of these things I think, oh, and then also you were near a fire, right? So you were probably around all these toxic fumes as well. So all of these things to me seem to be, I'll say immune suppressing and compromising your health and making you more vulnerable. So do you think looking back that it was the tick bite, the subsequent tick bite, the potential toxic fume exposure to the fire, right? All these things that you described, and plus the mushroom being undercooked, they all take a toll on your body and they weaken you, making you more susceptible to become pretty sick pretty quickly. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there wasn't any fumes because it has to be a year after the fire. Uh,
Okay.
but cluster headaches are. I mean, I also have like some autoimmune stuff. Like I have psoriasis, and that can kind of suppress your immune system a little bit too. Uh, but yeah, the tick the tick bite definitely like exacerbated things. It was crazy, like sitting in this hospital bed and feeling like, man, I shouldn't have a cluster headache attack. Like, what on earth is happening? And I could like feel like the synergy of them like in my brain. It was so bizarre. So that's actually in the hospitals when I got diagnosed with cluster headaches. Um, but I learned to, I had managed them before. I didn't know about exercise, but when they got chronic, I was like, I can't function. I will lose my job. I had to figure out a way. So I found a blog online where the guy was talking about exercising, but then eventually got on some herb supplements, and that seemed to help. But it was fascinating how the synergy of those two things interacting. But and then I was cool for a long time until I started eating gluten again, and then it kicked it back, and then into gear, and then just this year I got the cluster headaches came back out of remission for like 2 years because I got COVID. So I think maybe I said I don't have chronic Lyme. Maybe technically we could say that I could say that I do have chronic Lyme because of the complications. I mean,
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that you are, you know, a huge member of this wild food world, as you called it earlier, and you're studying these wild plants and mushrooms to use for food, but also these wild plants and mushrooms have a huge medicinal value as well. And the things that helped you the most with your migraines were herbs, right? As well. So I think there's a cool play there between your knowledge and your research and now using herbs, which are essentially plants, to help you with some of your health issues, right?
yeah, there were basically there's two that were really operative there, and they were migraine medications. It's Butterbur and Feverfew, and they helped, but they it did not help as much as not drinking beer and not consuming gluten. Those were the two really big things that I have to stay away from.
Got it. Now, looking back, if it were now and if you were bit by a tick today, what would you do differently than you did back then, right? Because you mentioned you ripped it off, you threw it away, you didn't really think about it. Would you behave differently today if you were bit by a tick?
Yeah, if it's an embedded deer tick, I mean, like a dog tick is one thing. If it's an embedded deer tick, I would take it and probably put it in some alcohol and uh and see if I can get it tested for Lyme. 'Cause I know you can send them in.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, and just for everybody listening to this podcast, we highly recommend if you find a tick biting you or you find a tick even on you that you think may have been biting you or a loved one, the University of Rhode Island has an amazing tick encounter resource center where you can take a photo of the tick and literally just set it in from your smartphone, right? And they'll come back to you within 24 hours to tell you the type of tick, the age of the tick, and then also how long it was attached for based on the analysis of the photo. And then as a result, provide you with a disease risk assessment report that you can use
Wow.
to bring to your doctor. And it's all free through the University of Rhode Island. And we've
Wow.
had Thomas Mather, the entomologist, on this podcast who runs that program. And look, I've used it dozens of times. Rich has used it dozens of times, and a lot of our listeners have as well. So that's one tip. The other tip is if it is attached and there is a high disease risk, factor there, you could potentially send it away for testing. I think, as you noted, Alan, right? So there's a lot of private entities out there that will do tick testing that are really spin-offs from universities. And then also, depending on what state you live in, if you look at our website, we have a tick bite blueprint. It's tickbootcamp.com/bite. But a lot of states like Pennsylvania, for example, have free tick testing as well through their state-run university. So depending on where you live, there might be a facility where you can mail the tick and just pay the postage, and they'll actually analyze the tick and tell you was it carrying not only Lyme disease but other tick-borne infections as well, right? So I always find that an interesting question because I had no idea, and we've only learned that through this podcast.
Yeah, and I know some friends too that will basically keep some doxycycline around.
Yeah.
And uh yeah, I remember being in the hospital bed, and after I'd got the rashes, and they said, we want to make sure that it didn't get into your spine, so we're going to give you a spinal tap. And I said, how much is that going to cost? Not having health insurance. And they said, between like $7,000 to $10,000. I said, I'm leaving right now. Like and I didn't know what I was doing. I was like taking my life into my own hands, and I was just like, but I can't afford that burden. I mean, 5 figures is like an insurmountable sum to me at that time. And I am so thankful. I'm pretty sure it did not get into my spine because I don't have any joint issues or anything like that. Because I could feel the doxycycline I could feel it leave like immediately when I started taking the doxycycline. I could feel things like that feeling of something inside my brain, like that was all gone. The palsy stayed for about 8 months. So I still had that, but everything else left, and I felt so much better right after I got the doxycycline, which I think is part of why I refused that. But in hindsight, it was a little reckless.
Alan, you mentioned that when you went to get your testing, they did the Western blot, which we know is not a perfect test, but I'm sure they didn't share with you that it's not a perfect test and that if it was negative, you were negative. What was the result? Did it come back positive? I just want to make sure I got that piece of your story.
Yeah, it did.
Okay. So it came back positive, and then they gave you the oral doxycycline from what you were just saying, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the doxycycline helped remove a lot of your symptoms pretty quickly, but not all of them. You mentioned the palsy state. And this is where I want to tie back to what you said earlier, where you had that feeling of like there was something else in your body, like you felt like this different person, right? And I think from how you're describing it, that's what a lot of other people in the Lyme community call depersonalization. Am I misunderstanding how you categorize that, or is that what you think it really was, where you felt this like unreal state, like you were a different person? Can you describe that more? Because we hear that a lot in this community, that it kind of changes how you feel, like this weird internal feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way I can describe it is like having like something in my mind, like in my psyche, like, oh, hi, we're here now. We live here too. Like some alien entity. Like there's like some X-Files stuff.
Yeah, and look, you're certainly not alone, because we've heard that and it sounds so bizarre, but until you've been through it and you had it, it's really hard to understand. But it is more common than people would think. So now talk to us about, Alan. You're in the hospital. You deny the spinal tap. You take the antibiotics. You feel a little bit better, and basically you're going back to work, right? Do things continue to get better, or do things get worse after this?
Things continue to get better with the exception of the cluster headaches, which I had not gotten introduced to the neurologist to give me the herbs for probably like a solid year and a half. So it was like 4 to 5 times a day during the busiest times of restaurant service. I would have to run down to the dry storage room and do hundreds of jumping jacks, or now I do burpees. So I'll do like 50 to 60 burpees, and that'll get my heart rate up to like, a buck 80, a buck 90, like exhausted. And then I'll go back to work and be cooking or expoing tickets or something like that. So I would have to do that like 4 to 5 times a day. I
And
call it
this was,
Alan's really shitty workout plan.
and that was a year and a half you had to suffer with that before you found the doctor after your Lyme diagnosis. Is that what you said?
Yeah, it was debilitating. Yeah, it was awful. But I didn't have a choice. I didn't have any money. I had had so much student loan debt. My interest on my student loan debt was more than my rent. Uh, yeah, it was wild.
What was the time period from your trip and being bit by the tick and becoming sick until the time you got diagnosed with the Western blot test? Was that a pretty quick time period there?
Within 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay. So the Bell's palsy, the eye patch, all of that was about a 1 month or a 2 to 3 week to 1 month window. And then after the doxycycline, you were kind of better from that really bad state, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, I could function again. I just had chronic cluster headaches now.
Talk to us about the stress, because you mentioned you had no health insurance. You mentioned that you weren't making a lot of money in your business, right? And that you had to work, and this stress had to be taking a toll on your body as your body's trying to fight, right? You're dealing with cluster headaches. You have some autoimmune, it sounds like, predispositions. Now you're dealing with Lyme disease. Stress is so bad for you when your body's trying to heal and recover from an illness. So how did you manage the stress, the illness, and your responsibilities to be, a functioning adult at that time?
Well, I kept going outside. When I go outside and look for mushrooms, it clears your mind, and the only thing I think about is like it's like a scavenger hunt, and it's very exciting, right? So the one thing I changed is that uh, one of my mom's friends was in the D was worked for the DNR, and he said you should try spraying your clothes with permethrin. So I started to do that, and I discovered like, hey, I go outside and there's no ticks on me. And it allowed me to go outside again. That was like the only way that I could go out and continue doing what I loved, which is like a form of therapy, just being outside. And that was the only way that I could go outside again. So I am a pretty strong permethrin advocate. I mean, it's definitely a compromise. We're, using
Yeah.
a natural insecticide derived from flowers, but it's still, a concentrated household chemical that's also lethal to bees and felines.
Yeah. I mean, you have to weigh the pros and cons, risk
Yeah.
versus reward, right? I mean, both might not be great, but which one is the better alternative there? I feel like. I do want to hear about your diet, right? Because it sounds like you had this pretty good knowledge about all of these wild foods that were super good for the human body, but only the elite were able to get if they paid a lot of money. But you were now finding ways to get them on your own, just in nature. And I wonder how much of an impact that had on helping you heal, because I'm a firm believer from my own experience and also hearing all the stories we've heard on this podcast that food is medicine, right? And especially you of all people, Alan. I mean, you must know that better than anybody. And I take herbs on a regular basis to maintain my health, and a lot of them are just things that you find in earth, right? They're plants. They're just plants that are just ground up and put into a capsule. So what are your thoughts on food being medicine, and also what was your diet like throughout all this, and do you think that had a role?
Oh, my diet could have been better. I mean, my joke about a chef diet is, well, I was making things I could never afford to eat, and like a chef diet is like eating a half rotten chicken standing over a garbage can as fast as humanly possible. Probably not half rotten, but that's the joke. I would eat things quickly during service, meat, a couple vegetables, stuff my face. We would as staff meal. Uh, I don't eat a lot of processed food. So like everything I am eating is from scratch, vegetables that are cooked, meat that is cooked, um, probably from reasonably good sources. So I don't eat a lot of processed food. I do have a sweet tooth, that I could probably cut down on. Uh, my diet was also very irregular. I would probably like eat just like a little bit at night, and that would be it. I would not eat, throughout the day. So it could have been better. Um, but I also didn't eat a lot of processed food, and I credit that for a lot.
Khalil, I have to apologize. I know you had your line of questioning here. I had so many questions for Alan. I'm going to throw it back to you, Khalil, for your questions.
No, diet is definitely important. But I was also kind of wondering, like, because I know back when I first got Lyme, I still kind of continued to work, and the work environment just it gets kind of weird when you're sick. When you're sick, you're getting sick, and you're still working, and you're dealing with coworkers who may not be believing you, thinking you're faking it, trying to get out of stuff. So, like, how did you kind of deal with that? Like, still going to work, like when you're first getting sick, and still trying to figure out what's going on and trying to overcome it.
It was really difficult because I felt like no one believed me, and I had a coworker, well, my sous chef, like my boss underneath the executive chef. He was having like a mental breakdown because he broke up with this woman and had completely gone off the deep end. And so my boss's like two of his like prized workers, he said, I have the new Alan and I have the new Chad. Kind of saying that we're worthless now. And he no one would believe me. Like, it's so hard to explain all these different things to someone. They're like, do you got a cold? Do you got the flu? Okay, if you don't, get on the line and cook. There was nothing about like, oh, your mental health, or why are you in the corner crying during service because you feel like there's something living inside of you, like that. They just think, oh, you're just broken. Like, are we gonna have to fire you? Like, it's is not very compassionate.
Yeah, I found that out as well. Like it's definitely something very hard to deal with. And also, like what were some of the things that you did to like? I know you say you got on doxycycline kind of earlier, which I'm pretty sure that's helped you a lot. Because the earlier you get on doxycycline, the more it can help a lot. But
Yes.
besides that, was there other things you did? I know you eat very well. Were there other things and herbs you took and like? You said I know the plants, anything like that. Anything else you did, like sleep wise? How was your rest? And you get a lot of sleep.
No, I mean,
Water
I've
intake?
working in the restaurant as it's a meat grinder, and it continued to be a meat grinder for many years until I left, until the restaurant I worked at, the last restaurant I was chef at closed. My I did not get much sleep at all, and I just worked myself to the bone the whole time, which probably did not help at all.
So and that Western blood clot, was that the only test you took for Lyme? Was that the only test you
Yes,
took? Still to this day?
yes.
So you didn't have any other co-infections or anything like that? You didn't come across any of those?
No, not to my knowledge.
Oh, that's pretty good there. Yeah, very good. Now, fast forward kind of to like where you are today. Like where you at in your business today? Like I know, like you say, you write books, do podcasts, TV shows. Where are you at today with your businesses? And how was that going? Like with still dealing, managing some of your symptoms, and how are you handling your businesses?
Well, it's it's fantastic. The business is booming, and it's so much stuff that I can barely stay on top of it as just a single person running a business. I'm doing all kinds of stuff. Everything was great until I got COVID, bringing my cluster headaches back this year. But even then, I've been dealing with them for so long that it's just kind of like, okay, well, I just have to, around 7 o'clock every day for maybe 2 or 3 months, I have to exercise until I'm gonna fall down on the floor, dripping with sweat, so I don't have pain. Uh, but in the scheme of things, it's like it could be worse. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I know.
it's great.
I know. Ever since with COVID started, a lot of people were saying. Like, I know I've talked to people who have Lyme disease and were kind of in remission and doing better. And once they got COVID, it kind of brought like a lot of their symptoms back. It's like the cluster headaches. Is that one of the only things that COVID has brought back for you?
It it is definitely the biggest and the one that impacts me the most. But you kind of learn how to keep functioning. And now being self-employed, if I don't get up and work and do what I need to do, like no one's going to do that for you. And the only safety net I have is the one that I create for myself. So kind of like that like forced death march is like that's the only option. Like there's no safety net for me unless I create one. No, so I obviously doing everything myself, like health insurance and all that.
Well, I know you say you work a lot, but like, how is your support system? Do you have like a good support system? Because I know, like, with being sick with Lyme, like, it's just a lot of stuff that can just happen and go wrong in mental health. I know it's always helped to have a good support system. Like, how was that for you? You feel?
Yeah, I mean, I have family and friends that I can talk to. None of them have had Lyme, so it's still like it's hard to explain to people, and people they don't really know unless they've had it and understand all the different permutations and things that can go wrong, uh, or all the other like tick-borne diseases. Unless they've had something like that, it can be hard to really feel like you're heard.
No, I get it because a lot of people say that you don't get it until you get it, but you don't want to wish that on anyone. But it's a very hard thing to explain because there's so many different complications that can arise from anywhere at any given time.
Yeah, you guys want to hear a crazy one? So,
Oh,
okay, so I was living on my ex's farm, and basically everyone on the farm, it was an intentional community. So kind of like an old commune your mom started in like the 60s. Everyone lived there was family, like a big family compound. And her mother, we don't know how many times she had Lyme. She's got to be in her 80s now. And I love her to death. I dedicated my book to her. She she had Lyme like so many times it seemed to like wear her immune system down. She would be working in the garden, and one thing we noticed that was so bizarre, she'd be working in the garden, she started to get like fungal infections like in her sinuses, and she would pull out occasionally these like long black threads from her nose, and they would have a head on them, like to bite, like to connect. Uh, yeah, yeah, like pulling an alien from you, and this would happen regularly. Um, the only thing I could think of is like her immune system was so beaten down from, she probably never went get in to get tested for anything. Um, their immune system so beaten down that things can, like, different opportunistic infections and organisms can now, get a foothold where they maybe wouldn't have had before. But that's the craziest thing that I had ever heard of.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything like that, and that is definitely crazy.
But I think, Alan, you hit it on the head. And I think this is just such an important message for everybody listening, that there are so many opportunistic things that we pick up over our lives. And not only that, we can be born with them, right? There's a lot of congenital things that are viruses or bacteria or parasitic, right? Meaning when we're born, we are born with them from our parents, right? From our mother in birth. And then we acquire things over life that, look, if you've had mono, that's going to be with you forever, as Epstein-Barr virus. And if we're healthy enough, our bodies can manage those things. But if we're not healthy enough, our bodies can't.
You can manage things. Like, I don't think I'll ever be like free of my symptoms, but I have a way to manage things.
Yeah, we call this the maintenance phase, right? So like we've tried to identify phases of the Lyme journey. And, we've created this acronym called PARM. And when you first get diagnosed, depending on how sick you are, I'll kind of quickly go over the beginning ones. It's the prehab, strengthen your body a little bit because you're so compromised. So strengthen your body, whether it be through sleep, whether it be through, detox, whether it be through whatever means, right? Mental health therapy. Then the assist phase is really killing, right? Killing the bacteria like you did with your doxycycline. Then the R is more the rehab. You have to rebuild your body because there's been damage to your body. And then the M is the maintain. And maintain essentially means you have to maintain a healthy lifestyle, because if you're drinking beer and you're eating gluten and you're not sleeping and you're extremely stressed and you're just really overwhelmed from a mental and physical standpoint, you're going to risk having a relapse or becoming even more sick, right? Does that make sense? That's kind of what
Yep,
I'm trying to put
absolutely.
together here for you. So, I want to give people hope that they don't have to suffer for life, that there is hope that they can use tools, and there's a variety of tools to feel better and maintain their health.
Yeah, the confusing part is, like, there's so many different, different tick-borne illnesses. Like, you have a starry from the Lone Star tick that can give people alpha gal, and then hunters get an allergy to mammalian meat. I mean, that's a bizarre one. Ehrlichiosis, babesia. It's like there's so much to unpack there, and it seems like it gets more and more complicated. I feel like it can be so intimidating for people. And I talk to people every year, um, and they're like, I just don't know what to do. And there's so many things to take into consideration. I feel like people get overwhelmed and they just try to, like, just suffer through it. And I feel like that can make things worse, but it can be hard to try to, be really active and proactive. That takes energy too, right? That people are, maybe low on. It's really hard. And I feel like some people will just try to put it in the closet and forget about it, and they just suffer and suffer and suffer.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really good points I want to pull out and just build on a little bit there. The first one is, you're right. There's so many things that are out there that make this complicated. One of them being the meat allergy or the mammalian meat allergy, alpha gal syndrome from a Lone Star tick. And, there are some great resources out there. So, unfortunately, where I live, alpha gal is extremely common on Long Island here in New York, but there aren't many doctors who understand it well enough to really help people. But there are resources out there. And, we've interviewed the two alpha gals who have made it their mission to help the alpha gal community. So they have their own podcast, their own platform. They've partnered with the leading researchers in the world to better understand this and help people. There are tests for alpha gal, but many doctors don't even know they exist, right? And they're relatively affordable if you have insurance. And if you don't, they're a little bit more obviously out of pocket, but we can run these tests to determine if you have alpha gal. And I'll just share, if anybody's listening and wants to learn more, the best website I've come across for AlphaGal is alphagalinformation.org. And it has all the tests you can take. It has all of the, different severities of AlphaGal, right? Just mammal meat versus potentially even taking an Advil. If there's a meat, meat filler that can make you very sick from taking an Advil potentially. So that's the first piece that I wanted to share. And then the second piece is, it can be very overwhelming when you don't have support, right? So this is where I want to circle back to Khalil's question regarding support in your community, because do you have a team of doctors, Alan? I mean, where you are today, have you since gotten health insurance, and where are you at with your community of people, not only friends and family, but medical professionals that help you through some of these things that come up when you get reinfected with COVID or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I mean, I have health insurance. Finally, after I got self-employed, I could finally afford it. Uh, for the, dealing with the cluster headaches, Western medicine does not have much for me. The only thing they gave me after they diagnosed me, and I'm working in a kitchen with open flames every day, they prescribed me a tank of oxygen that was going to be really expensive and like a Darth Vader mask that I was going to have to bring into the kitchen to oxygenate myself, like while I'm expoing tickets, and I was going to have to have this oxygen tank on a cart. The chef has to look strong, right? That like I couldn't do that, and I couldn't afford that. So the only stuff that has helped me, and I'll be totally honest here, for the cluster headaches, I have found that I have to dose myself with psilocybin, especially before I go on a plane, because the barometric pressure change will kick me into a headache, and it could be so bad on a plane. Like when I was going to New York this year, I thought they were going to have to get a wheelchair for me just to be able to get off the plane because the headache was so bad. Um, yeah, it's kind of a longer story, but if I take incremental doses of psilocybin, it will kick me out of the cycle, and then they could be in remission for years. But that's not Western. You're not going to go to a doctor and get prescribed that. I got to go to my special doctor.
Yeah, and that's what I mean by your medical team, not just Western medicine, but
For sure.
Eastern medicine, right? So are these naturopathic doctors? What kind of doctors are these? And what are you doing with them? Because the psilocybin, we've heard this, right? These psychedelics have really powerful effects in the Lyme community as well when it comes to neural retraining, right? Because sometimes in your case, I'm not so sure this is what it is, but a lot of people tell us they were sick for 10 years. Their brain pathways have been altered from being chronically sick, and the psilocybin or the psychedelics helps reset their brain pathways and almost like there's a reboot of the brain, right, with the brain chemistry. But I think there's a lot of tools that we don't understand enough about yet, and we will as time goes on, because I think it's Johns Hopkins who's doing a study with psilocybin and Lyme patients. But what are your doctors that you're seeing? Are they naturopaths, and what other things are they dealing with you?
Uh, no, it's not a doctor that I'm saying. It's just a friend of mine. And before I met him, I knew that some places were doing studies with psilocybin, so I taught myself to grow them. The potency was variable, so some of them didn't help that much, but it helped enough so that I knew, like, oh, okay, this could be an option because nothing else works. Like the doctors will have nothing for me. It's like prescribing an oxygen tank or some crazy expensive shots. And to be honest, the exercise works better than anything the doctors had given me. So it's really, I have a GP for Western medicine that I don't see very often. And the things that I just have my little bag of tricks and my toolkit that I have found that work for me. Uh, but yeah, it's like Western medicine didn't have much for me.
Yeah, if people watching this are not watching it on YouTube, they're not seeing our faces. And I'm sitting here smiling, Alan, because I'm not surprised that, psilocybin being a mushroom, right, that you've grown your own and experimented on your own and have had success, right? So again, I think it ties back to the ability of you to understand these things like wild mushrooms, wild plants, and then to work with friends and take these low cost, no cost paths to experiment to see what helps, and even just exercise, right? Even the psilocybin, even the diet changes of beer and gluten to find ways to help yourself. I mean, from your background, can you speak to why psilocybin do you think helps, or is this just something you heard about and you tried and you don't know too much about the science or what it's doing, in the human body?
I don't know a ton about the science. It's something with the blood vessel. It's my occipital nerve gets inflamed with the cluster headaches behind my right eye. Like it's always in the same spot, and it's just like an ice pick like this. I feel the pressure release, um, but it's like something with the blood vessels. So I can feel that release once I am exercising, or if the mushrooms kick in, I can feel that pressure release, and then it's like I'm clear again, and I know I'm not going to be in pain. That's about as scientific as I get.
That's a great explanation. So, Alan, tell us about your book, because you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that you have written a book, and I believe you're working on your second book. So, if you can just tell us the name of your book, where people can find it, and then what you're working on now.
Oh yeah, my the book is called The Forager Chef's Book of Flora. It's recipes and techniques for cooking with wild plants vegetables, garden plants, herbs, nuts, seeds, starches, and people can find that. I mean, it's sold on Amazon, any place good books are sold, Barnes and Noble. My website is foragerchef.com. That's where most people know me from. And my second book, so the first book was Flora, and the second book will be Fauna. So it'll be the meat component to kind of complement that, like the yin and the yang there. So it's going to be all on different types of meat and cooking techniques, everything from woodchuck to peacock to interesting cuts of beef. Um, it's going to be a lot different than my first book, a lot more visceral.
That's great. And your website, foragerchef.com, I mean, it's got just so much information. You have a ton of recipes using wild mushrooms and plants. And you also have, I think, guides on there as well about foraging plants and mushrooms and things like that. So could you just share, if people go to your website, again, it's foragerchef.com, what they're going to find on there and why they should go take a look?
Well, when I started, there was no resource for cooking with things. There was guides that would say, like, help you find out if something was edible, but we didn't have Facebook groups yet. There's really like only mycological societies. In these guidebooks, some of them would try to take pictures of the food and it didn't look appetizing. So I wanted to create the resource that I wished was around when I started. So it was just a passion project. Um, so, I mean, it's geared toward the Midwest. So especially people in the Midwest and upper Midwest, but people from around the world can find useful things there. So yeah, there's guides on like profiles of plants and specific profiles of specific mushroom species with lots and lots of images, because images and videos, there's videos for tons of things too. So it's, kind of like a one-stop shop for learning about identification, but also bring it onto the plate, how to treat these things, how to store them so you don't get sick. Lots of stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Alan, I checked out your website in preparation for this podcast interview with you, and it's just brilliant. There's so much content and so much good information on there. I'm going to hand it back over to you, Khalil, to see if you have any final questions. We've had Alan for a little over an hour now, so I want to be respectful of his time. But Khalil, if you want to just finish us up and ask the final questions, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, just kind of wondering, like, what are you working on? Plans for the future? Next few things you're working on? I know you say you got the upcoming book. Anything besides the upcoming book you're working on?
Oh yeah, a couple things. The book is the biggest one. I'm going to turn the manuscript in October. I'm trying to work on a line of botanical t-shirts. We should be launching pretty soon a line of my line of mushroom knives that are handmade in Finland. I'll be cooking a few events this year. I'm going to be doing some private chef work down in the Caribbean and the British Virgin Islands, and then going outside still whenever I can to find new things to cook with. And I always have kind of like a big target list of new species and things that I want to describe every year. So a little bit of the same stuff that I've been doing and plenty of new things too.
Just to kind of tie everything together, how do you feel like your experience just from dealing with Lyme disease and everything just helped you to where you are today?
I mean, I think it taught me resiliency. I think the struggle made me a stronger person. What it doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Um, yeah, yeah, it made me resilient.
No, it definitely will, because it'll test you a lot and put you through a lot and make you find out what you got, see if you got what it takes just to try to keep fighting and pushing. Like, any final advice you would have to give to anybody dealing with Lyme experience for the first time?
Yeah, to be proactive and learning and you know be an active participant and keep an open mind to different avenues of treatment. And I would also say if you go outside a lot, spray your clothes with permethrin.
And kind of just backing up what you said, just being an active participant, I can just kind of tell, like, just from this interview, like, you were very active in figuring out what was wrong with you, how to figure out how to take care. You saw you went to the doctors, you saw the rashes, and you kind of just knew to kind of take steps. Because a lot of times with dealing with Lyme disease, you have to like talk to your doctors. Like, sometimes you'll let the doctor just tell you what to do and this and that, and just try to follow every little thing they say. But sometimes you gotta have to just speak up for yourself and just tell them what you're feeling and what you're experiencing, because no one is experiencing what you're experiencing, how you're experiencing it. So just being able to speak up for yourself is definitely a good perspective and point of view.
Yeah, and to ask for the doxycycline, you know.
Definitely. That definitely does help, especially if you catch it early.
Yeah. Alan Bergo, Khalil and I can't thank you enough for joining our Tick Bootcamp podcast. We've learned so much from you, and we can't wait for this podcast to launch and for everybody to be able to learn from it as well. So thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.